given species, there was some defining property that made the things of that kind the kind of thing that they are. It's a possession of some property, some intrinsic property that things have. That's what makes things the things that they are. One thing philosophers do is sometimes take simple problems and make them really, really complicated. But this is a really powerful way of thinking, and it dominated scientific and other kinds of thought for quite some time, almost 2,000 years. Now, I've noted here in red, right, and that means you're supposed to pay attention to it, that he called these, or at least people who adopted the Aristotelian program, call these essential properties. So being something means that you have that essential property. So there's a commitment to essentialism. And this is, I like this characterization of what essentialism is, what essentialist thinking amounts to. So if you're an essentialist, you think that natural kinds have essential properties which define those natural kinds. And all and only the members of that kind have that property. That property, that intrinsic property, makes those things the kind of thing that it is. And explains everything else about those things. So, for example, a hypothesis about what the essential property is for man is rational being. And I said man on purpose because that's the way Aristotle would have spoken, which, as you'll see later on, suggests some poor hypothesizing, maybe, or poor conceptualization. But rational being is supposed to be the essential property for being a human. Now, what this does, thinking about a property exemplifying what something is, if something's a kind of thing, well, members of that kind might possess or have or exhibit that property to different degrees. And if that's the case, if you think of the essential property as exemplifying what that thing is, as an ideal form, the closer you are to expressing the property that way, the more you are that kind of thing, or the closer you are to the ideal type. And as you move away from that expression, so if you're not as rational as somebody else, that would mean, in the essentialist view, that you're less of a person. So that's one way to understand this. Related to that, although essentialism is distinct, but related to that is a view about teleology. Remember, these are attempts to explain the diversity of what we see. Why do we see all the things we see? In teleology, that means goal or purpose directed. And you can think about this over time or at a time. Diachronic or synchronic is the way we can describe that. And the way that this was interpreted is that over time, the history of life can be described teleologically. That is, it culminates in humans. And this is an example of what's called the great chain of being, or the scala naturae, the scale of nature. And it shows that different kinds of objects in the world are higher or lower being. And this gets adopted in medieval and later times. This gets hooked into religious belief too. And so there's this teleological view, and I have a diagram later that I think nicely displays some of this. There's this view that it's not just that humans are at the top of this scale over time, but in hierarchy also. And in fact, hierarchies get added above man. And when they get added, some get added below in terms of there's a split in some cases between men and women and between races. But above man, you end up getting a whole series of angels and archangels and other kinds of things. So this way of thinking gets embedded very deeply and entrenched very deeply in how we think about who we are and what our place is in the universe. So altogether, I'm going to call this typological thinking. And this is a kind of loose, this is a term that means lots of things to lots of people. But here I'm going to use it as typological thinking means both a commitment to essentialism and a commitment to teleology. And typological thinking ends up being used to explain why we see the things we see in the world and justify social structures too. So it becomes really deeply entrenched in all kinds of ways, both philosophically, politically, socially. And one thing I really want to stress again, I mentioned this before, is this idea of variation away from the ideal is deviation. And you can see that in certain myths and principles that are included in all kinds of different belief structures. So there's something about variation that's understood as deviation. Okay. Now, doing biology, if you're a typologist, means not just for people or for humans, but for any species. If you want to know what thing that is, if you want to understand the nature of a species, then what you need to do is you need to discover the essential properties of that thing and describe those properties. That becomes the project of biology. Okay, so that's the background. Then comes Darwin. Now, Darwin wasn't the first evolutionist. There was other evolutionists before him. And I'm going to show you on the next slide what the difference is between Darwin and Lamarck, for example. At least in terms of one, I think, very key part of their commitment, of their description of evolution. But Darwin was the one who really put things together and made a case like very few ever have. He's an incredible scientist. If you've never read The Origin of Species, you really should read The Origin of Species. If you want to read it in class, I make all my students in Philosophy 3370 read The Origin of Species. It's a great book. It's a great example of how to make a good argument and how to do good science. But the main contribution he makes is he gives an account of evolution by natural selection. And this entails both a pattern of evolution and a particular process of evolution. I'm not going to talk too much about the process here. I'm going to talk a bit more about pattern and what that means in terms of how we think about biology today. But really, his two main contributions that can be described as the pattern of common descent and evolution by natural selection. So, I like this diagram. I forgot to put a site on here. This is from a website called treethinking.org, which promotes tree thinking, or thinking about evolution and biology in terms of evolutionary or phylogenetic trees. This contrasts three different ways of thinking about the history of life. So here we have a creationist version of the history of life, or one creationist version. This axis, the y-axis, is time, and each of these circles indicates a creation event that then persists over time. And you can see how this can be wedded very easily to either a teleological view or an essentialist view. I'm not going to describe that in too much detail. But in here, notice, the lines do not cross. There's no common ancestor between any of those lineages. So that's a creationist view of the history of life. Lamarck was an evolutionist, but he had a very particular view. And I remember when I was in high school, I was taught that Lamarck thought giraffes stretched their necks, and that's why they got longer necks. And that's kind of something Lamarck believed. But that's not really why Lamarck was so very wrong. Okay. Lamarck also thought that the various things that we see represent distinct lineages. So notice these lineages. These lines represent the history of these lineages. On Lamarck's view, these lineages did not cross. There was no common ancestry between these things. Now this is a cartoon, so various versions of Lamarck, you might see some little bit of branching, but he thought that we could look at the various kinds of organizations of life and from that infer the history of those lineages. So the lineage we're on is the most developed, so it's a deeply teleological view. So our lineage, if you trace our history back, we may have started off as worms or something, but we've progressed to the highest part of that chain of being, at least the highest that's on Earth now. Finally, we get to Darwin, and this is common descent. So here, these lineages come together. They form branching patterns, and there's a single origin to life. Now, Anya Platinsky is going to be here Friday. I think she's planning to at least mention a couple of challenges to what this tree of life looks like. It gets really messy. And it turns out, this is, as it is, a cartoon, right? Things cross over a little bit, but that's still very much within the idea and scope of Darwinian biology, Darwinian evolution. So, Darwinian thinking, at least from a pattern point of view, is a commitment to representing the history of life as a pattern of common descent, as opposed to distinct lineages or created lineages. Okay. Ernst Mayr, which would be 100 years old, pretty good. 1959, as part of a celebration of the publication of The Origin of Species, wrote a great paper describing population thinking. And he contrasts population thinking with typological thinking. And what's really important about this paper is by 1959, Darwinian evolution was pretty well accepted. Although, again, I'll let Anya Platinsky, again, she's an expert on this. I'm not. Darwinian evolution in the beginning of the 20th century and through the beginning of the 20th century got wedded to Mendelian genetics. And that's the neo-Darwinian synthesis. And that's, in many ways, the framework we're working with today in biology. And although Darwin was hugely influential in getting evolution accepted, soon after The Origin was published, natural selection as the mode of evolution started falling out of favor. And there were lots of competing theories about how evolution worked. By 1859, though, Ernst Mayr, along with a number of other influential and important biologists, had really made the claim that neo-Darwinian evolution, and going back to Darwin and the notion of natural selection, was really central and important for doing biology. And that's the way we ought to be thinking about natural selection. Population thinking, though, is a huge departure from typological thinking. So I've given you some bullet points there that explain that. The idea being that species are collections of organisms. They're populations. And rather than thinking that the average of some character represents some ideal or some type, that's just a mean. It's just a statistical mean. And it's not anything real. So just like in the U.S., families might have on average 2.5 kids. It doesn't mean there's any families with 2.5 kids. And it doesn't mean that families, the further away they are from 2.5 kids, it doesn't mean they're any less an American family. He also stressed the importance